If you talk to many old Bangaloreans, we complain. We're complaining about the weather, which is the nicest weather in India. We're complaining about everything.
What is the central character that you remember that you think hasn't changed? Talk a little about that.
I just want to hark back to what we understand of that word cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
When you grew up in Bangalore, you didn't grow up with any singular identity. And we had never seen a slum before. We had never known what a slum was. There were no such things in Bangalore then.
Yeah?
Yeah. And then we went to Madras, where there were slums. When Krishnadevaraya died and Achyutaraya came into place, Kempegowda applied to him to construct this market town and a fort. He was granted the permission to build a mud fort. It was the policy of Vijayanagara at that time that only the outlying areas around the borders of the kingdoms were allowed stone forts, and if you were inside, you had to build a mud fort.
Bangalore is amidst massive change, The city has changed from a pensioners' paradise to the tech startup hub that is today. At virtually every level, the city's cultural landscape, the people, the food scene, the music scene, virtually all aspects of the city's undergone sort of dramatic shifts. How did Bangalore get here? What was Bangalore like? Not just decades back, but centuries back, actually. And what are some of those important strands that have shaped the city to what it is today? Many people today say, actually, that the city has an identity crisis. Some say that this is a city in transition, right? A melting pot. Maybe sometimes it's good to go back to the past where it all began, go back to the roots that tells us where the city comes from. And I thought with somebody like you, who's been a chronicler of Bangalore since the 80s, a publisher of multiple sort of platforms. I mean, I was looking at it. You had city guides like Bangalore This Fortnight in the 80s and the Bangalore Monthly in the 90s. And then, of course, Explore City, which we all know about, right? Invested by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. And our podcast, of course, that you launch, The Literary City and the History of Bangalore. And I thought, who better to understand where Bangalore comes from, what its roots are, what it used to be once upon a time, and what are some of the shifting influence that has shaped the city of today. And maybe when people say they don't understand Bangalore of today, maybe the past will offer us few clues to understand Bangalore today. So thank you, Ramji. Thank you so much for coming here. Delighted to have you on the podcast. Go to Culture is our monthly podcast where we dive into voices and stories from the city. And today we are going to dive into the history of Bangalore. How did Bangalore come here? At multiple levels, from the food to culture to the music scene to language, right? And even the history of the city. Those are some of the areas we are going to dive in. But first, before we get into any of that, maybe history of Ramji, right? In the 80s, when you were an 18-year-old boy, and what was this city about? Do you want to take us through to the 80s? This was a pensioners' paradise. IT tech startup had just begun to happen. Do you want to take us to the 80s? What this city looked like, felt like for an 18-year-old boy then?
I'll answer first of all, Malini, I like the work that you do. I like your podcast, so I'm very happy to be here. So get that in place. To cycle back to some of your questions, you talked about the identity of Bangalore and why do people have trouble trying to understand the identity of Bangalore, trying to give it shape and form. I'd like to step on that one first and then cycle back to your second question. So with regard to the first question, this has been my quest now of late. I've been chronicling Bangalore since I started that city guide called Bangalore This Fortnight back in 1988. That's when I started it. And 88 through 89 was the first launch of the magazine. And then it's been pretty much consistent from then till now. In more recent times, it has been described as Tech City. It has been described pensioners' paradise and Garden City and so on. And then even in articles, we have listed out some 20 or 22 different nomenclatures for the city itself. But that apart, the essence of this entire city has been placed in what was described as cosmopolitan. And the reference to that word cosmopolitan and the etymology of it, it's often confused as being westernized or as being sophisticated in a sense, but the real meaning of cosmopolitan just simply means diverse influences. And that's how it is. So the question is, how did Bangalore get that way? It was the big question. I'm writing this book, The History of Bangalore, and the one thing that is coming back to me over and over again, it didn't get that way. It started that way. It was always that way from the beginning. And I'd like to introduce you to a concept that I stumbled upon and have since embraced. And as a consequence of saying it now, I own.
Mm-hmm.
There's a word in Kannada. It's called KUDALU. So KUDALU, as in the standard expression of the Kannada phrase, means confluence. When you talk about the confluence of roads,
Mm-hmm.
it means the confluence of people. And if you think about it, go back as far back as you really want. From the beginning, the trade routes have involved people from all over the world. So even if you pedal back to the beginning, like the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, you've had the Yavanas, which included the Romans, before them the Greeks. Along with them, all the Levant, Arab, and Persian traders who have come in over here, right? The Indians themselves from different places, or from what might have seemed then as reasonably alien cultures, which might be peddling back now, which is people from North India coming down on the trade routes called the Dakshinapatha, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
that used to come down over here. And all of these trade routes met at different junctions because movement was by bullock cart and on foot, mules
Okay.
and so on. So they had to rest. So where they rested was near bodies of water, along areas that made some sense in order to rest. And these KUDALUs became hubs where settlements started to grow. Eventually, there was one man who decided that this area needs a market town, not just a KUDALU, not just a historical place where people lived, a temple came up, settlements came around, the agriculture fields were close by, and they integrated into the whole urbanization of that trade route, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So he decided, and this is Kempegowda I'm talking about, obviously, he decided that what he would do is to set up a market town, a pete, if you
Mm-hmm.
like. And the reason that he set up this pete was because he felt that the time was ripe to build a rather large KUDALU over here, in which people would actually live. So it was purpose-built from scratch to be able to accommodate this entire business of getting merchants to come to a central place.
I have a question. So, if you look at history, almost all civilization sort of has come up on the bank of rivers or a water body, right? And you find Bangalore is one of those rare cities that is landlocked, right? No water body. So
Right.
by that yardstick, Mysore or some other city by the river would have been a better location to sort of build a city even from scratch.
The improbable history of Bangalore is the subject of the lectures I'm giving recently.
Yeah.
And that's a question that I ask. Because if you think about it, if this was really a KUDALU, if this was really a place where market meant, the big question that I had was this. First of all, Bangalore's 3,000 feet above, with rocky, largely inhospitable terrain.
Yes.
Who in their right minds would have a bullock cart full of goods that said, yeah, the best way to get from coast to coast is to climb this 3,000-foot mountain and then get down the other side. And the other, obviously, is that this has become a major city which is not near a water body, because that's when it was. That was actually the two questions that started off this entire quest as to what is
So
Bangalore?
then why?
Why did it happen?
Yeah, so despite these two big odds, right, not next to the water body and the terrain, the height, all that, why would somebody settle down here?
Sadly, there is no single answer to that question. I don't think anyone has. First of all, I don't think anyone has answered that question, but to tell you the truth, after having spoken to a lot of people in the History Academy, I don't think anyone has really asked that question either in that significant way. And maybe there is no reason to get a clear answer for the whole thing, because, in fact, it happened. trade routes did go. Oxen, mules, and people did climb these 3,000 feet. The only
So you mean
explanation.
via what is now today Bangalore, right?
Yes.
Okay.
What is today Bangalore is to be described as the entire region. Now, for instance, when people talk about the history of Bangalore, they start at 1537.
Mm-hmm.
That's when the Pete was built.
Yes.
And they say the history of Bangalore started at 1537. My quest was to find out what happened up to 1537. Why did 1537 happen?
Mm-hmm.
It just didn't happen on a whim.
Mm-hmm.
Something happened, must have come to it. And so I started to dig back into history, and these two questions featured heavily on my mind. Why did it happen? And that quest took me all the way back to the oldest object that you can see in Bangalore today, and that is the Lal Bagh Rock. So people are fond of saying it's 3.4 billion years old.
What's the significance of Lal Bagh to the history, and how is it linked to the history evolution of the city?
I'm going to try and compress many months of my studying geology into a few sentences, but effectively, there were supercontinents close to Antarctica that started to break apart. One of them, the creation from some other breakups called the Gondwana supercontinent, most recently broke up, went into Australasia, went into Africa, went into a couple of other places, and what we recognize today as the subcontinent of India moved from where it was at an astonishingly rapid pace at the time of some 20 centimeters a year, which is, if it happened today, it would be cataclysmic. Because of the shifting ocean beds, there was no atmosphere at that point in time. There was no oxygen. There was nothing on Earth. Earth was just getting formed. And this plate moved at this astonishing pace and collided with the Eurasian plates. And that collision caused the Himalayas to come up.
Yeah.
Right? But this landmass itself, as it moved, geologists have tracked that as when it moved over Seychelles, it was subject to a lot of volcanic activity for a reasonable portion of time, short by their standards, which is 10,000 years of volcanic activity in the Seychelles, which caused Madagascar to break away from India and go and come to roost near Africa, the eastern coast of Africa. And there's a lot of speculation about the shape of one coast, but the shape of the west coast. But what happened was, as a consequence of the breakaway, two things happened. Number one is that the entire Deccan Plateau tilted from west to east.
Okay.
All right? This is the reason why almost every single major river flows from west to east in the south. If you look at the map, you will find they all start near the Western Ghats.
Okay.
And they all flow into the Bay of Bengal across the entire route from the south. The other thing was the creation of the Western Ghats, which are not really mountains, but an elevation caused by this breakup of Madagascar.
Okay.
And that is called a shoulder uplift, if you like, which is a part and parcel of this tilting of the landmass. And so that became a place where you had the origins of the Western Ghats and everything that they've done to influence it. So these Ghats run all the way from the southern Gujarat all the way down south, and they grow higher and higher and higher as it comes down to the south. So over there it's fairly shallow. Over here it can reach some pretty significant heights. One river, however, major river, I'm not talking about tributaries and small little canals and so on. I'm talking about major rivers. Krishna, Godavari, Kaveri, all these things flow from Western Ghats down to the east. There was one major river called the Periyar, which flowed the other way and went into what we know today to be Kerala. And the significance of that is that that's where the first Greeks landed, and that is the place for them to land. On the east coast, there was Arikamedu, which was another town that traded a lot with the Eastern world. So this connection between the two and the tilt of the plateau, the cause of the rocks that happen in this area is called the Dharwad Craton, which is the entire substrate of rock, of which Lal Bagh rock is one. And the Navadurgas that exist around Bangalore, Nandi Hill, Savanadurga, all these places, major hills that exist, which sort of have a semicircular arc of protection around the Bangalore bowl, basin, if you like, which is elevated, is the ones that shaped how the trade routes moved. Because the trade routes had to follow paths navigating between these rocks. And so there were 2 or 3 paths. One of them went through the Kongu region, which is a part of the Karnataka kingdoms. Coimbatore and Erode would be the easiest places to understand for that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the trade routes came through the Palghat Gap, which also influenced our weather. So those trade routes moved down from there, met the trade routes coming down the Dakshinapatha. So if you really were to just take any map over there and start drawing lines on it, you will find the intersecting point is around here, right?
Oh.
So you have Begur, you have all these small little towns that existed around this entire place, which is now referred to as the Bengaluru Taluka, if you like, from those different places. That was the entire central nerve center of the trade routes. So why did people have to climb over here? I mean, they didn't have a choice. Either that or go all the way around. So this was the easiest place for them to climb. And as a result of being in these nerve centers was what caused this KUDALU of not just people, not just roads, but everything that came with it. The cosmopolitan nature, the culture,
language,
the influences,
food.
All of it.
Shall we just sort of zoom out to the more recent times and talk about Ramji, the 18-year-old in the 80s? What was Ramji at 18 seeing in the city? What was city like? What did it feel like to a young boy?
Well, I was up to no good, I can assure you that much. But the history of me in Bangalore goes back way before. On my mother's side, we're several generations old in the city.
In this city?
Okay. And my father's side, I'm the 3rd generation resident over here.
Okay.
So really, this is my town, and this is what I recognize. So growing up in Bangalore was natural for me and my sister, and we grew up over here. It's our home. This is where we've always known. We've not known any other place per se. Happily so.
What stands out in your memory when you look back in that to that era, right? 70s, 80s, when you were growing up, what did Bangalore feel like? And especially because you've been chronicling, I think you have a more keen and intense eye to also remember what this place felt like.
Many of the things that are spoken about Bangalore today was acutely true back then. The business of it being cosmopolitan. So if you take a look at everything that happened at the time that I remember the city to be, this city remained pretty much the same as it always was right up to the 80s. In 80s, there was a shift. There was a discernible shift to the way Bangalore existed. And by the 90s, it had changed shape in more ways than one. My argument is that the central character of Bangalore has not changed at all. It has just become a little more acutely aware of what happens. If you talk to many old Bangaloreans, we complain. We're always complaining. We're complaining about the weather, which is the nicest weather in India. We're complaining about everything. But it is very interesting for me to find out what new residents of Bangalore actually feel about it. And I'd like this from the Quetch levels. What are they complaining about? What exactly are they talking about versus us? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the old Bangalorean complains less about today's Bangalore than the new Bangalorean does. And this is something that we have lived with. So we understand that change is necessary.
What about the city to hang out, things to do for a young person, young adult, club culture that we speak about? Do you want to sort of remember some of those things that young people do when they are 18, 19, right? What was the city like at that point of time?
Mercifully, there weren't too many distractions for us.
When you say distraction, what do you mean?
No, I mean that the clubs, there was not a big club scene here at that point.
Really? I was told this city had a lot of very active club life, a lot of...
By clubs, are you talking about places like the Bangalore Club, and you're talking about...
So that's one part. And then places where you could get drink, they belted out good music.
Restaurants. They were all centered around restaurants, principally. That's pretty much how it was. So restaurants were clubs of the day, if you liked.
Okay.
That's all there was to it. Bands played in restaurants. Everything was restaurant-centric. Bars were, they were bars, but
There were bars. And
yes, they were.
which were the ones that you remember, which were really hip and happening?
There weren't any like that. There weren't any bars per se that were great and hip and happening. You're now talking about what period of time? You're talking about the 70s?
80s, that I'm talking
So
about.
by the time I got back to Bangalore from Delhi, it was 88, 89. That's when I
Okay.
came down. And at that time, already there was the beginnings of a pub, right? The very first pub that was in Bangalore was opened by the Codes. It's right next to where people
Okay.
might remember. There's what's a good, well, right on Church Street and Mission. There's a social. There's a bar also. Just 2 doors down from there, and the same building, was this place called Ramda Pub. And that was the very first pub that was set up in Bangalore by the Codes. It didn't last. I don't think their heart was in it. But by definition of pub, they drew draft beer there. And then my friend Ashok Sadhwani set up the pub on Church Street. And that was the place that we hung out all the time in Bangalore.
Any specific restaurant you remember? Not the pub which came up in the late 1980s, but at that time?
There was a restaurant called Three Aces, which is on MG Road.
Okay.
It was the swankest restaurant of its time. And Three Aces was a place where they had a jazz band playing, etc.
Oh, wow.
Koshi's was another location where they had the Three Aces was the first place to have a cappuccino machine. And Koshi's was very, very well known at that point.
Yeah.
And Koshi's was then, like it is today, there's a daytime life to it and there's a post-dusk life to it. And there are different kinds of people who show up there. But I clearly remember that they too had a quartet, a jazz quartet playing in the air-conditioned part of that restaurant today. I live in the non-air-conditioned part. It's my second home. But that's pretty much where it was. There were a couple of other places, and then towards the, I think the early 80s, etc., towards the middle of the 80s, there's this restaurant called Chinlung, which still exists.
Yeah.
And Chinlung at that time had a band playing there called the Human Bondage. And they were like the biggest rock band that existed, totally. And the Human Bondage used to play over there. And at least 3 or 4 of us, we didn't have the money to go and have dinner at Chinlung. We were broke kids at that point. Nobody had any money at that moment. So I still remember a bowl of noodles was 10 rupees, way out of budget for us.
You used to get pocket money?
I used to do odd jobs to earn money for myself and so on. It was a different time, you know.
Yeah.
It's a question is most people didn't have wealthy parents.
Yes.
We didn't come from money. We came from predominantly middle-class families. And money was never a denomination in discussion. And especially in Bangalore, you talked about the existence of so many people from professional class of people that came to live in the city. Let's understand that actually had an impact on a couple of things. Number one is we had a very large percentage of middle class to the entire population.
This was a middle class city.
It was a middle class city. So the super rich and the super poor were not as visible as the middle class. It also meant that all the values that we grew up with were middle class values. You didn't show off all that much. So I'm very fond of telling my Delhi friends that the difference between a person in Delhi and a man in Bangalore is that we wear our Rolexes under our sleeves.
I don't know if you noticed, but it does come to me, stands out, is when you speak about these independent restaurants having live bands play. And especially for a town, small town like Bangalore, it was a special thing. Not every small town had bands, restaurants, all that, right? Experience that they offered. At least not other towns in the city, I mean, in the country.
No, I think there's a good reason for that. I think that basically cultural expression was very important in Bangalore. Generally speaking, in the South, you know, it's a facet of growing up that, well, at least the girls of the household were always made to learn something about music or an instrument and so on. But as far as we were concerned too, we always thought that, again, you know, I'm not making a sweeping statement including everybody in Bangalore, but certainly my peer group, we were very, very acutely aware of how much we knew. These were the identifying factors. So your general knowledge had to be pretty good. How much you read, how well read you were. These were the things that were important to us. So we grew up showing off what did we show off? We didn't show off material wealth. And there was a good reason for that. We didn't have any. So what we did was
intellectual
yes,
quotient.
that's right. So we had something to show off.
Yeah.
This was acceptable to show off.
What was cuisine as a sort of culture?
It was a big deal.
It was a big deal
Yeah.
because of that?
One was that, but you didn't even ever go up to a formatted situation like that. I'm talking about something even more basic. This interaction that I'm talking about was not that you went to a place where there was a contest and you shined there. This was in daily interactions with people. And so that was how it was. So if you made a reference, like a Shakespearean reference, and the other person didn't get it, then we'd get a chance to become a little snobbish about that.
Okay, I get it.
Right.
So, 88, you returned back to Bangalore. How has Bangalore changed? What's now this 23-year-old, 24-year-old, whatever your age was at that time when you came back? What were you seeing in the city?
When coming back to Bangalore didn't feel very different. I was very happy to be rid of the summer of Delhi, I can tell you that. I started to react badly to the summer, physically, I mean. I couldn't tolerate that anymore. And I literally didn't know what I was going to do. I just got back here because I knew that my gig in Delhi was up. Licensing had gone, everything was, that writing was on the wall. So when I got back, I was pretty much broke. I didn't know what I was going to do. The first day after I got back, I had no plans. So I had to pick myself up from that point onwards. So the way I saw that city had less to do with how do I enjoy the city than how I survive in it.
Okay.
So that's pretty much how it was.
And then you decide to launch this Bangalore this fortnight, right?
Yes.
It would have required a lot of courage to do something like that. And why this? Why a city guide? Was that a thing at that point of time?
The way I saw it, I kind of realized that Bangalore was on a growth path.
You really saw that?
I did.
Tell me one or two things that made you feel, even at a subconscious level.
It was a feeling in the air more than anything else that people were going to move in over here. By that point in time, I noticed...
Is it the Texas Instrument?
Nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with that.
Just that feeling in the air.
The first migration during that point in time that I saw were people selling their small little flats in Bombay and coming here to buy massive flats and enjoying a lifestyle.
Okay.
And that was the first thing that I saw when I started talking to people.
These are retiring people?
No, they came here and started businesses. I'm not sure what they did over here. And people I do know were selling their apartments, very small, 750 square foot, 800 square foot apartments in Colaba and places like that for 1 crore. And they came to Bangalore, bought this for 20 lakhs, and they had 80 in the bank to live with. Now, this, of course, doesn't go for everyone because, demand and supply, it catches up. But understand that this was the possibility at that point in time.
This is the reality even today. In our data report where we are looking at numbers, Bangalore, buying a house in Bangalore is, despite all the inflation, everything factored in, it's far more affordable to buy a house today here than Bombay and Delhi also.
Wow, I didn't know
that. It still
yes.
is, which is surprising because, there's just house prices have gone so high. So, yeah, this is a VR city report, we call it, but it's an annual study that we do on India's top cities. So, edition 1 came out last year. Now we are working on the second edition.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Look forward to getting my hands on it.
Absolutely. But going back to this, so this whiff of change, that growth, anticipation that you were looking at, one was this house thing that you mentioned. Anything else that you remember?
Yes. A lot of people that I knew in the advertising fraternity in Delhi, for instance, they were all moving to Bangalore. I suddenly saw that corporates were moving here. Brook Bond was coming in over here, for instance. And way before tech really made an impact, there was all these other signs of people that were moving in. Corporates were moving in here at that point. I suddenly realized that growth was going on. And I saw how suddenly Bangalore became a major center for a lot of advertising national campaigns. So a lot of money was coming in from this point in time. So it was inescapable. It was in the air that this place is is going to be in the focus of some assault that's going to happen.
Yeah. In fact, as you talk about, I do know that this is also in some way fashion capital in a very different way. So Arvind Mills, Reliance Retail, many of their ventures, from Nike to Adidas, many of these companies, right, which are in the different kinds of apparels, fashion wear kind of thing, they all have located here. And 80s, you are absolutely right. In fact, many companies were actually exiting Calcutta, headquarters in Calcutta. They were moving out of Calcutta to either Delhi and Bombay. And they were flocking to Bombay a whole lot. And maybe some were moving to here.
There's a lot of reasons why some of these things happened. I think that corporates moved in over here simply because it was more affordable and, lifestyle-wise, it was easier, etc. And again, you go back to the origins of Bangalore, the cosmopolitan origins of the city. It was always the case that people moved in here from wherever they did.
Yeah. So when you began to chronicle this Bangalore, this fortnight, right? And what were you capturing? What were you noticing? What was this telling people, and who were your customers? Tell us a bit about it. It will give us a sense of...
So you were talking about pub capital and fashion capital and so on and so forth. My entire career in publishing was built out of those things. Because there were pubs, people came in here for the weekends. It's funny how economics works. This veers more towards free economics than it does economics. First of all, a lot of places were dry, in the sense that Tamil Nadu, you couldn't go there.
Okay.
Like even in Delhi, you remember when you had to buy alcohol, you had to go to one of those grubby government stores. And then what brand of beer? Do you want the 12 rupee one or you want the 10 rupee one? That was the brands of beer that you bought. So over here, suddenly you had these places that looked great because people dressed up the pub. It was not a dingy, dark place where you went to hide from your people. Yeah. The places were dressed up well. We weren't. So we used to go there in shorts and t-shirts and so on. But we noticed that the people who came here people who used to take buses from Hyderabad on Fridays, come in here.
There were people doing that, huh?
Plenty.
Okay.
Get drunk silly and stagger back to work on a Monday, always having some excuse for why they couldn't come in to work on time, I'm sure. Likewise, people from Kerala. Likewise, people from Tamil Nadu. They all came in here and the place was packed. All weekends were packed. They all used to come to the pubs. It gave rise to a lot of other stuff, and that's the free economics part I'm talking about. Retail in Bangalore became big because it started to seem like it was a weekend town. So suddenly there was a retail started to happen. Retail started to grow at that point. You talked about fashion capital. Yes, people like Gokuldas and the others had garment manufacturing over here.
Yes.
That would have been the driving force for the Arvinds and the others to come down.
Yeah.
Not a fashion sense.
Yeah.
So restaurants started to grow, we always had a culture of independent restaurants. So that started to grow.
Darshini's also emerged in the 80s, right?
Pretty much, yes. Because it had to cater to a very wide diversity of food tastes, etc. So we already had things like that, whether it was a burger or a Darshini. You had all these things. You went wherever your feet took you at that point in time. But Bangalore started to become known for its retail, its pubs, its restaurants. And I'm talking about the early 80s. Talking about the early 90s. And that's how it always was. And so you had restaurants, you had shops that sold things. A couple of other things that Bangalore was famous for, one of the things that people don't talk about that much these days, is silks. So people came to Bangalore to buy silks for weddings.
Oh, that's
so
interesting.
When they came here for shopping, trousseau shopping, if you like, for weddings, they also bought other trousseau elements. Like, how it is that the girl side always had to buy all the suits for the groom. And I hope those things have stopped. But still, that's the way it was. So it gave rise. I mean, I know this personally because that's how I built my business, because of this. So this I know intimately. All of the shops that came up on Commercial Street, MG Road, Brigade Road, principally Commercial Street and MG Road, was on account of all the shopping that happened centered around one for trousseau. Trousseau shopping was a big deal. And so the growth of Bangalore was properly cantilevered, if you like. It wasn't just that there were a lot of factories, so a few people became super rich and everybody who worked in the factory was poor. It didn't happen that way. I remember writing once about an incident that I saw at the pub, where there was this, a lot of people were packed together, and I saw this group of people sitting around, and one guy said, sitting across the pub there was his chairman. And that itself tells you a certain egalitarianism itself.
Yeah.
So I asked this guy, I couldn't help overhearing him, he was right there sitting next to me. So I asked him, I said, he's your chairman? He's saying, yeah, he's my chairman. I said, so why don't you go say hello to him?
It's very rare of that era.
Completely. So I said, why don't you go and say hello to him? And the guy looked at me and he says, damn right, of course I will. So he picked up his beer and he went over there. And then I saw them talking. And that man made him sit down, got him another beer, had a long chat. And, then I lost interest and I went back to what I was doing. But that stuck in my craw, that I published it as a story in one of the magazines I was doing to illustrate the sense of egalitarianism in Bangalore. And the reason I mentioned it was because I had not seen that in Delhi. I could not see that happening in any other place. So even as a Bangalorean, clearly, by practice, I saw that to be different from what I had seen in other places. And that is a definite building block for the DNA of a city. Just that one incident tells you something about it.
Do you want to sort of tell us a bit about the history of the city? When did it begin?
One of the deciding factors to determine what is the history of Bangalore is that most histories of Bangalore, per se, they're actually not many. There's one book by Fazlul Hasan in 1974.
Yeah.
And that talked about the history of Bangalore. The other things are all like memoirs, pretty much, or essays, collections of essays and recollections and so on. There's no history book per se, which is what I'm writing at this point. And I want to do it justice, so I'm working as hard as I can to do it. But one of the determinations is something that we have spoken about a little earlier. When does the history of a place start?
Yes.
So 1537 is the most popular line in the sand, if you like, for starting to narrate the history of Bangalore. To me, there's an entire history that leads up to why 1537 happened. It didn't happen out of nothing.
Yeah.
So there must have been a good reason for it. And I have gone over in our dialogue so far about the business of how this was a result of the urbanization of trade routes and the KUDALUs and how it happened. And to me, that has been a very fascinating journey of discovery to understand why did this place come to exist and why was it necessary for it to happen. So 1537, we should understand that as the same kind of convenience that determines why a mall comes into place, right? So if you take a look at what a mall really does, it's a place where somebody invites a whole bunch of merchants to come together and make it convenient for a large number of buyers to come to one place so they can get what they want. And then you have some distractions and diversions and so on and so forth. And that's what makes a mall a good mall, per se. Now, a mall, we understand that to be a physical location, and it's, this is what it is. But if you were to just take the kernel, the very core of that principle, and apply it to what became the Bangalore Pete, that's exactly what it was. It was a place, it's a market town where a whole bunch of merchants were invited. They built it by segments, so different people of a certain nature could go there. It's not very different from all the shoe shops being next to each other in a good mall and so on. So you build it up and then you make it relevant and easy for people to actually come in there to interact with the merchants. Now, who were these people coming in there? It's not that there was a large urban resident population. They came there to buy goods. These were merchants. They were traders. They were wholesale people. And if you look at the construct of the Pete, which I've looked at in some detail, every gate, there were 8 gates to this Pete. Every gate that was placed had a reason for it, had a geographical reason for it, and it led to a certain type of trade, a certain type of geography. So if you look at Bangalore, the south led up to the entire Kongu regions and the others. There was a big movement out there. Cotton was very heavy at that point. Towards the east, if you look at the geography of Bangalore, remember I talked about the tilt, the rocks. So if you look at the geography just in just one city, relatively small city like ours, there is such a huge difference between the east of the city and the west of the city.
Explain that to me.
Sure. The east of the city, which tapers down, is much more fertile. It's a place where water comes to log in these places. Now, I'm talking about Domlur and beyond, for instance.
Okay.
Domlur, for example, you have a huge, the entire area was a big swamp at one point in time, but it was also paddy fields, and it was a very rich agricultural area.
Would Koramangala come as part of that?
Sort of.
Yeah.
Sort of. Koramangala was not really a part of it. Koramangala exists in descriptions in the 8th and the 9th centuries as places where water tanks were built around the temple of Begur and the KUDALU of Begur and so on. When I talked about KUDALU, if you go down to the Begur area towards Electronic City, you see this thing called Kudal Gate or KUDALU Gate or something. There's one place like that. That was nothing but just a toll booth for trade routes. And that's what I meant by KUDALU.
Okay.
And to double down on that point, if you study the map of the south across Karnataka principally, you will find many towns are named Kudal.
Yeah.
Many, not one or two. These were all hubs, big trade hubs at one point in time or the other. In fact, in Sangam literature in 1 AD, Madurai is called a Kudal town. So the principle behind this is just lost to us, and I'm trying to bring out and connect the dots. But this business of the Kudal cities or the Kudalus were how these trade hubs started to come about. So you had Hebbal, you had Begur, you had Kolar, you had all of these places were rife with activity at some point in time. Nestled in the middle of all this, when the Bengaluru Pete came up, it just made sense to everyone to gather in over here.
So what else do we know about the history of Bangalore? So we talked about 1537, we talked about the 8 gates, Petes, the east and west. Tell me more. Tell us more about the history of Bangalore.
Maybe I should pick up on one thing that you asked me earlier, which was the water sources and why we'd be here. So how did it exist? How did it feed? We didn't have any rivers to talk about. And the answer to that, I found out, was entirely rainwater harvesting. So it was a big deal. There are hundreds and hundreds of inscriptions that make virtue of people, kings and others, who built tanks. Even today, if you were to look at Google Maps, pan out a little bit and take a look at the area of Bangalore, even to this day, despite all the talk about fading lakes, you will find a large number of blue patches on the map. Every one of those blue patches was a man-made tank. I'm sure some of them might be natural, but not significant. But that's not the point. These natural places where water would have collected were turned into tanks and sluices. There's an inscription. It's in Epigraphia Karnataka. And this inscription dates back to 890 AD, 9th century, during the Ganga era. And it talks about the constructions of sluices in the tanks and the construction of tanks. The tanks that are named, for instance, the tank that is named is the Belandur tank in Sarjapur Road. That is a tank that is named. And they were talking about the creation of a couple of smaller tanks next to it. Look at the map, you'll see it. And they talked about the sluice gates that were placed over there. And they said, this inscription says that so-and-so placed the sluice gates. And obviously they made a big deal about it, and they're all very happy about this incident. They carved it on stone and placed it for us to read centuries afterwards. Why? What is the significance of sluice gates? Sluice gates control the flow of water. What do we learn by this? We learned that there was rainwater harvesting, and that these gates led the water through channels into whatever they wanted, like irrigation, home use, and a whole bunch of obvious reasons as to why these gates were installed and why the tanks were installed. When you follow that story and you find out that these tanks were interconnected, it was necessary not to just build a little tank and keep it, but then there would be overflows and underflows, right? So these overflows led to other tanks. In Bangalore, the same thing happened over here. The tanks that are connected, for instance, you'll find Alsur, what was Sampangi Lake, which has now become Kantirava Stadium, all the way down to Sankey Tank. We have drained out quite a few of the lakes.
Absolutely.
Like the lake that fed the Pete, for example, the Dharmamudhi line, the tank, which is now the bus stand, at this point in time, that happened there. One of the first few lakes to be drained out was across the street from UB City. what we know, that Indian high school, St. Joseph's School, leading all the way up to the lake. That
Mhm.
entire thing was a lake. It was a tank.
Okay.
And then the British, for instance, drained it out, saying that now that we have water supply, we don't need this. So let's get a polo ground over here. So they built a polo ground in that place, for instance. And so on. Then we went and said, why only polo? Let's drain the whole thing out
The
and build a
stadium.
stadium. So
Yeah.
that's a little interesting aside as to how this thing functioned. Let's take a look at Cubbon Park. The way Richard Sankey designed the park to function, and it's not a big deal like some earth, no pun intended, earth-shaking idea, but the whole point was that rain would fall on top of the hill, which is
Mhm.
now the cricket stadium. It would flow down Cubbon Park, where it would collect in 4 ponds, and those ponds would become the life sources for the trees of the park that he constructed, and the overflow would then drain out in 3 or 4 channels and drain all the way down to Sampangi Lake. This is the existence of that area, the Cubbon Park. I believe that even today, rainwater harvesting is a major component of how we get our water today. It's not all from Kaveri stage
Yeah,
1 through.
so I think we are fed by Kaveri water by around 52%, and 48% is actually we are depleting groundwater resources. If I get my numbers right, at least it's evenly split between around Kaveri is around 50-52, and rest is underground water.
My big deal is to find out how much of rainwater is harvested and what component of supply. I have with me a scientific paper, but I have not bothered to corroborate that. So it's just that one scientific paper that suggests that 40% of our needs, the city's water needs,
Are
is
being met by
rainwater harvesting.
Okay. I'm not aware.
Which is not, I don't think that rainwater harvesting has really swamped, again, I'm using too many puns over here today,
Mhm.
the entire nature of how the city works. So if that is really the case, then there's hope that more can be done.
Yeah.
But it's one thing to complain about the fact they drained this lake, drained that lake, etc., etc. It's another thing to figure out that, like deforestation, there can be afforestation, there's something else can be done. Now, there was some depletion of those water bodies in Cubbon Park. But then look at the number of rainwater wells that have been dug in Cubbon Park by environmentalists.
And across Bangalore, I think rainwater wells, rainwater harvesting, all that is happening.
Sure.
Right? That's
what I meant the small microcosm of example, which is Cubbon Park itself. There was, I was actually, this is close to me, because when I started a magazine called the Bangalore Monthly, one of the things that was happening was that there was a big move to just get rid of Cubbon Park. And one day, just after I'd launched the magazine, I got a call from Justice M.F. Saldana, who was a judge of Karnataka High Court. I got a call that says, Justice Saldana wants to see you in the court. So what have I done? So I said, fine, let me go there and see what it's all about. So he told me about this plan. He's saying, look, you need to write about this. So I said, sure, we'll write about it. That led to him sharing some information that he did with me. And I wrote a couple of stories. And that story, the cover story, I'll send you a screenshot of that, is titled The Conspiracy to Kill Cubbon Park.
This was which year?
96.
Okay.
It was used as part of the submissions, as part of a PIL to Justice Saldana, who actually issued a suo motu order stopping the destruction of Cubbon Park. But one of the things that happened over there, these ponds that I told you about had been silted over, had been completely silted. And when they started to dredge it, they found all kinds of stuff coming out of there, ceramic ware, that sort of stuff coming out, wash basins and so on. And so they suddenly found out where did the debris come from? How did this debris find its way into the park? Ironically, from the extension of the High Court. So we followed the story. What is the story? There was a contractor that had been given a contract back then of 18 lakhs to take the debris and put it in the outskirts of the city.
And he dumped it there.
He found it much easier to just drive it into Cubbon Park, dump it there and come out.
And that construction waste and that getting dumped all over illegally, it continues.
It does. So the whole idea at that point, which has never made it to press, we are not allowed to, I was not allowed to print it either, was that there was a move by two builders to say that we don't need Cubbon Park, it's a wasteful thing, we should make low-cost housing in that area,
Okay.
right? It was stopped.
Yeah.
And all the encroachment was stopped as a result,
Yeah.
and awareness grew.
Yeah.
My point is this. My point is, these wells that have been dug in Cubbon Park today offset all of this degradation. And now the park, I assume that because of these wells, the water supply to
It's
these trees are
healthier.
just as good
Yeah.
as it ever
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
So which means it gives us hope to understand how this can go on for the rest of the
Yeah.
city.
Yeah.
But the question we're talking is not about that. We're talking about the history of it.
Yeah.
So from the 8th century onwards, in fact, even earlier than that, there's
So we are going back before 1537, and what this
way back. I'm talking about 890.
Yes.
And even earlier than that, as a matter of fact. Like, how we understand the history of the Kadamba dynasty, for instance, largely is from one single inscription, right? And this inscription talked about the entire lineage. Now, how were these inscriptions? These were all prashastis, they were
Tell
called.
me more about Kadamba dynasty. I don't know. And what is the significance of Bangalore there?
So, if you talk about the political order of the city itself,
Yeah.
this area did not have a political entity until the Gangas came in.
Which is when?
4th century. So anyway, the point is that this was before the state was formed. Like what happened before there were kings, and somebody said, no, we need a leader. And so these little villages used to exist independently. The village headman or some wise council would persist, and that would take care of the needs of the village. The temple there would take care of the needs of the village. And then what happened when one village had to talk to the other village? What happened when one agricultural land was under dispute between two villages? So that grew to the need for somebody to oversee this. One thing led to another, and then there were kings. And this is the origins of the political state, per se. How it was driven and how it was done in order to make sure that the status of the king was maintained very high is seen in all these inscriptions that we talk about, these prashastis. So you'd have a prashasti that would talk about this king, glowing terms from the top to bottom, the whole lineage. The entire thing is written, the whole lineage
and
is
Ganga
written.
dynasty was the oldest.
Plenty, yeah. There were a few others, but not in terms of the political entity here.
Yeah.
At the bottom of that entire inscription would be the reason for that inscription, that so-and-so granted a tank over here. All right, but in the meantime, they've covered the whole history. That's the only way we know our history. How we know the Kadamba history, which was a contemporary of the Gangas, because if you take Karnataka per se, and that influences the city of, you cannot talk about the history of Bangalore without talking about the history of Karnataka, which is what my podcast is all about. I trace all the dynasties from the Kadambas. Kadambas, Gangas, contemporaries. So they existed at the same time. So,
and geographically, where were they?
The Kadambas were further in the north.
Okay.
They were in
and
Banavasi.
Ganga?
Banavasis. The Gangas were in Talakadu, pretty much. They were first in Kolar and then in Talakadu near Mysore.
Okay.
So it is north and the south.
And from a Bangalore relevance point of view,
Gangas.
Gangas. So,
well, there were two.
Okay.
There was the Gangas and the Nolambas.
Okay.
So both, again, this little city with two kingdoms managing it.
Okay.
So you had the Gangas and the Nolambas, and they both were controlled over that.
Can you talk about the significance of these two?
Absolutely, absolutely. The Nolambas had control over the Tumakuru areas up to the north.
Okay.
So their influence started to come all the way down to a thing that was a great bone of contention, which is Nandi Hills. So Nandagiri was always referred to for centuries in our history, per se. Anything other than that was controlled by the Gangas. So that area to the north and the entire thing was the Nolambas. And they called themselves the Pallava Nolambas for some reason. Maybe it made more sense for them. It's a little bit of a tenuous relationship, but it still was there. The Gangas existed in Talakadu, and they ran pretty much most of the areas of Bangalore. So the history of Bangalore is more Ganga related than anything else for the longest time. The Kadambas were significant because they were the successors to the Shatavahana dynasty that actually monitored and controlled all the trade routes that always existed in this region well before the Gangas.
Okay.
1st century, 2nd century, 3rd. So we're talking about 200-300 years of even before. We're talking about maybe 1 century prior to that. So right from, let's say, call it what you will, 100 BC if you like, right down to the 4th century, this place was always the recipient of trade traffic.
Which Kadambas controlled?
Kadambas took over from the Shatavahanas, and the Gangas came into place over there. So there would have been some schism at that point in time. But suffice to say that whatever was the influence that the Shatavahana dynasty was looking at would have gone more to the Kadambas than to the Gangas.
Got it.
So there's no record that exists as to what precisely it was and who had claims over which tree, and we don't know all these things. But logically speaking, you know that some of it existed.
Okay.
There's one pillar called Talagunda pillar, which is near Banavasi, one big pillar. It's an octagonal pillar. On the face of each pillar, the entire dynasty of Kadamba has been carved out over there. And that again goes back to the 5th century, 6th century. It was written in Sanskrit, the combination of Sanskrit and some Kannada script. And it was written by the rules of Sanskrit poetry. There's a whole reel I've done about that completely. It ends with saying that, and then the last of the kings granted a tank. So it tells me that the business of rainwater harvesting and how this area fed itself goes back that far.
Yeah.
So by the time you come down to the tanks that we're talking about,
1537.
yeah, by the time you come down to the tanks, we're talking about something that's been around for several centuries. And how the tanks were constructed, how these things were interconnected, were all a part of our knowledge of history, per se.
So when you speak about traders from all parts of the world coming to India and then going past Bangalore, right? Was Bangalore the only KUDALU that was? Which were some of the other hotspots where some of these diverse strands were coming together in a confluence?
So, I talked about Begur. And in your electronic city, you see KUDALU Gate or KUDAL Gate or whatever it's called right now. That was one, for instance, a major one.
Outside of this sort of geographical, any other part of?
Oh, plenty. I mean, if you really look at it from that standpoint, there were a lot of places. Think about loading up a bullock cart and traveling with it across the plateau. You'd probably have to stop a lot. It probably took a month or more to make that journey, which means you stopped every night. So where would you stop? You wouldn't stop in the middle of nowhere and get attacked by bandits and so on. So they would have had places where they stopped.
Yeah. So the reason I'm asking is, this cosmopolitan character of the city, which we put back to some of these trading hotspots that this city had become. What about other cities? I mean, do you find these early signs of cosmopolitanism, which is very, very unique about this city, also manifest in other parts of the country, or maybe it did not? I'm just asking because
it's very relevant. That's a very relevant question. Bangalore, on top of all of these things, was always a transitory place. If you think about Bangalore, I'm not talking about anywhere else, I'm talking about here. It was transitory in nature. So when the Pete was constructed, it was not constructed out of centuries of life existing at that point. It was constructed out of no life existing at that point, right? So from that perspective, the entire life of a place that existed without a deep ethnic history of its own, except in locations here and there. I'm not talking about you go down south, you get to Mysore, it's a different story.
Yeah.
But right down inside this basin, in the middle of the Navadurgas, if you really look at it, it didn't have, it's not as, it's like I said, there was no such thing. So we've always been a transitory, migratory place, a location. That has not changed either. That still is the case.
Yeah.
So you can put down roots over here. Like take a look at last names, for instance. If you look at people, like you might have somebody who was called Belur Krishna, for instance, B. Krishna, and that stands for Belur because he comes from there. At some point in time, people from here started to be called Bengaluru Krishna. When did that migrate? When did that change happen? It's interesting to spot that etymologically. That could have only have happened after the 16th century, which means that migration took place, people came to live over here, and then they adopted this name as an identifier for themselves. So if you go back in time, you will find places that existed in other parts, as you said, other parts of the country or the state, where people have older identification names, like Hassan so-and-so, Belur so-and-so, Banavasi so-and-so, etc., Belavadi, Apal. So you have all of these places here. So these are all places that are referenced by the location, which means that anybody who has Bengaluru so-and-so in his name is as recent as the 16th century onwards.
Yeah.
So from that standpoint, maybe it'll take another 1,000 years before this is being described as a place of ancient origins.
In fact, another marker of it is the 107 languages in this city, right? That people speak, and I
Really,
think
that many?
yeah, 107
Okay.
languages. It's the most in the country.
I speak two.
And it is a marker of this diversity that you are talking about, and maybe underpinned in centuries and decades of sort of past, right? That it comes. Maybe can we just quickly go past? I know we could go the entire day on this, but maybe Cholas and come to the Kempegowda time, and what was Cholas like and what was Kempegowda, and close the loop on history of Bangalore.
So as far as the Cholas were concerned, they were a very trade-focused empire. They only were interested in trade. To that extent, there's a similarity between them and Kempegowda per se.
Okay.
In similarity in that respect. One of the things that I discovered was that when the Cholas attacked, and when they came there and took over this area, my big question was, what are they trying to take over? And the answer to that was in the exception. So all of the history describes how they went into Western Chalukyas, they defeated them, went to Eastern Chalukyas. They pretty much defeated the entire south. There were campaigns everywhere. But they abandoned all of these places politically and only interested in ruling Gangavadi. That's it. If they were politically interested, it was theirs to keep. I'm sure there would have been some troubles, whatever political, administrative hassles there could have been, wouldn't have been easy. Nonetheless, that's the way it was. But they, for a little over, well, close to 200 years, existed in Bangalore, existed in Talakadu, and that's all they did.
So I have a question coming to Kempegowda, which is 1537 that we spoke about. So we have Gangas, we have Cholas, we have Hoysalas, and then Kempe. What is the significance of Kempegowda? We've had multiple dynasties sort of have influence in the area, but I think Kempegowda has a place, a special place in the city. Can you talk a little about that? Then we can sort of pivot to another topic of the history.
So he was never a king. He never sought kingship. There was no Kempegowda kingdom. He was a Palegar. He was a feudal chieftain. There were many Palegars during the Vijayanagara era. They were all given charge of the... So that's how things existed. There's an entire aspect of history which centers around how the feudal systems were created. Also in other parts of the world, right? It's called the segmentary state, and there's a whole theory behind it, books written on the subject. So as far as the Palegars were concerned, they were the people who administered their land.
Okay.
They were in charge of their own fiefs. They were fiefdom. They collected taxes, and they had to share a good component of the taxes with the kingdom. This is how it's always been. The Palegar system came into effect. I mean, it got consolidated during that time. And the Yalahanka Nada Prabhus is another way of saying Palegar. The Yalahanka Nada Prabhus existed since the 14th century in this area. And Kempegowda was great-grandson of the first of them, as it stands, from what we know. There are inscriptions that describe it. So when he came into place at that point, he was looking at what was going on, and he recognized the potential for a market town. Prior to that, he had helped Krishnadevaraya in a campaign against a wayward Palegar nearby in Shivanasamudram, which is really in Bangalore itself. And he became a favorite, as it stands, as it appears, of the kingdom in Vijayanagara. When Krishnadevaraya died and Achyutaraya came into place, Kempegowda applied to him to construct this market town and a fort. He was granted the permission. He was granted the permission to build a mud fort. It was the policy of Vijayanagara at that time that only the outlying areas around the borders of the kingdoms were allowed stone forts, and if you were inside, you had to build a mud fort, because they were a little worried that the Palegars get a little too independent. So he had to build a mud fort, and he built the Pete, which is the permission he got. So he built the Pete. I have recently gone through a lot of published material on what were the considerations on how he built the Pete. What were his thoughts? What was his business plan? And how did he solve a problem? What did he do with the whole thing? How did he sell the place? It's not some romantic notion that he just dreamt up this place and it came there and some rabbit chased a dog. Bengaluru was built from a very intelligent business plan, no different from any opportunity that any businessman would have pursued, in the sense that he saw a place that had the space for a market town and he built it.
So would it be fair, Ramji, to ask that prior to that, this was a transit trade route, right? This was a transit.
Yes, it was.
Kempegowda was the first person who thought of it as a settlement.
Yes.
And where anchorings would happen, right? It's moving it beyond a transit place to a more anchored development. Would that be fair assessment?
Entirely true.
Yeah.
That is what it is.
Okay.
So he satake that as a place where it could be, a settlement could come in.
Okay.
That was the market town that he constructed.
Okay.
So he would charge people to be there and take a portion of taxes, and that's how it was built. So to understand how this happened, look at it from the point of any business set up by anybody anywhere, for that matter. So what did he have to do? It was a real estate project, if you like. So
which continues to be a booming industry.
It certainly is. It certainly is, and a transitory and a migratory one too.
Yeah.
So he had to make sure that he built this pete, that people would actually come and live there. So which means they had to uproot themselves from wherever their traditions were, villages, move food and family into the pete and say, this is my new life. There was a lot of problems that existed that very often are swept under, because you understand these people had to come there from a village life into what was a crowded urban zone. In a small area, you have hundreds of people living cheek by jowl. And so how do they come to exist? How do they cope with the sudden crowded environment in 1537? It was not different from what the complaints, when you talk about, earlier you asked me about complaints. I've recently done some content on what the problems were in the pete and how this urban...
Talk about 3-4 of them just to make it alive for us.
So look at it from this standpoint. So when Kempegowda constructed what he constructed, again, let's not go into any sentiment about any of these things. Just practical elements to the whole construction of the pete itself. So he constructed the pete. Now there are several principles of architecture that are in scriptures. Artha Shastra has a whole bunch of them, and within that contained is Vastu Shastra, and within the Vastu Shastra is Padavinyasa. And these are all 3 different principles that determine how a town should be laid out, how the streets should be laid out so that wind can pass through them to give more sanitation. And then, of course, the Artha Shastra has divisions of the town or the fort, saying that this area is for Brahmins and a lot of caste-based stuff. There was a little more egalitarian in Kempegowda's market town, where it was divided by trades. Because you might argue that has to do with jati, but the fact of the matter is that it was principally designed for what trade went into what part of the pete by what that trade needed. For instance, the outer part of the pete was all for the heavy stuff. So, the people that repaired carts and so on, they were all near the gates. So anything that was polluting and heavy were all near the peripheries. As you got deeper and deeper inside, now the areas that had to do with cotton, for instance, needed large amounts of open air, sunlight, breeze. So they were designed in that part over there. Right in the heart of the pete, where the 2 streets that were first constructed called Doddapete and Chikkapete, right? They're called Avenue Road and whatever, Old Kacheri Road or something it's called these days. That area, that stuff in the middle is called Doddapete Square. And that is where it all started. So around that area, all the jewelers were placed because they needed protection from dust and security. That's how it was done. And so when you had bamboo people and the others who didn't need too much of cart movement and foot traffic was good enough, they were given all the narrow streets and so on. So this entire pete began to get constructed on the principle of what a trade needed at that point in time. It was great. It worked. Everybody moved in over there. Then you put enough number of human beings in one crowded area, you're going to have problems, right? So the problems started to come about. Factions started to develop. So historically, we have always had the right-hand faction and the left-hand faction, and these being two big deals. That's etymologically also the origins of right-wing and left-wing politics, if you like, but that's another, let's not go there. So if you look at the Pete, what problems started to happen? The problems were both from faiths, in terms of religious persuasions, not narrowed down to one's jati versus another and one's hierarchy versus another, not so much of that, but grand two factions that were right-hand faction and left-hand faction, sometimes expressed in the religions that they pursued, and sometimes in other considerations, where a group of traders would join one faction and another the other. And finally, it came down to a big fracas and bloodshed between them. There were fights on the streets.
That would happen often?
Oh, yeah, it happened. To the extent that it bubbled over that by 1800, when after Tipu fell and so on, the first of the administrators actually stopped the right-hand faction from taking out processions in the left-hand faction's streets.
Oh.
So there was a lot of this going on. But the point is not that there were arguments. Of course, you put enough human beings, as I said, there'd be arguments. But importantly, understand the construct of the Pete having to deal with all of these things. So when you think about Kempegowda building the fort or building the Pete, he had to take into account not just the area. So number one, he had to take into account the civic order in the city. So you had people called Talawars. That is the same thing as today when you look at in the north, you have a community called the Talwars.
Okay.
They're people of the sword, Tal in Sanskrit. So they were the people that pretty much governed that place and kept the law and order. They had jurisprudence, courts that would determine and adjudicate. So first of all, the first level would be their own block people that would administer something that needed to be done, but it went outside of them. It would go to a body of people, sometimes to a federal authority, like the Vijayanagara authority. Remember, all this belonged to Vijayanagara, not to Kempegowda, right? So all of these divisions would exist, and federal authority from Vijayanagara sat in the form of the Mahamandaleshwaras, the generals, the administrators, the accountants. These were all people appointed by the kingdom to oversee the work of all the Paligars. So these people were the states, and you had the central government people who would come in and look at it. It's not very different from what we do today. It's pretty much the administration. So you had the Pete, you had all of these things going on in terms of the jurisprudence. So you had to have internal security. For external security, the fort would be the external security. Now, it was a mud fort. So a mud fort could be defended up to a certain degree. It would not withstand heavy cannon fire for too long a time. You had to be stoned to be able to last a little longer, which is the reason why after Kempegowda the first, Kempegowda the second, as the case as it's told, constructed the watchtowers around Bangalore so that there would be advanced warning systems. See, you can't hide an army coming in. So that's pretty much how it was. So this is how the Pete was formed. And if you really expand outwards, you remember I talked about the Navadurgas? These huge rocky outcrops prevented the movement of large armies. They had to narrow themselves down to get through places. So pretty much it was a well-protected area.
You know, some of the areas that I thought we could possibly look at, which I had on my mind is, one, there is this theory about the dichotomous existence of the city. On one side is the Petes and the other is the cantonment, and two very distinct character of the two sides of the city. And people are keen, at least I was very keen to sort of understand the shaping of these two and the coming together of these two, and how over the centuries and over decades, the two sides have shaped up. That was something that I wanted to. And as I was researching on the book, you know, one of the things is that this is a transit hub, the migration pattern. And that have been shaping the city, its culture, linguistic, everything. Just understand that at a deeper level, at different phases of time, where were these people coming from the south, international, domestic, north, and how every wave kind of left an imprint on, and you know, you can see the language, you can see the cuisine, food that's being sort of eaten, all kinds of things it manifested in, and that was another area. You were mentioning about the contemporary, sort of one of the areas that you get a lot of interest in. What was that? Can you explain?
In the composition of Bangalore itself, when you talked about the cantonment history per se, the cantonment was principally a military town. It existed in Srirangapatna before, and then it was moved to Bangalore, much against the wishes of Wellesley. But nonetheless, it was moved here to Bangalore. And once it existed over here, it started with a fort, and then in the piece of land that the British got to build what they built. There was never an involvement of the East India Company, and that is something that's interesting to know. Everywhere in India, the East India Company was the one that set up the cantonments and the others. In Bangalore, it wasn't so clear.
Okay.
It was the British Crown that had a direct involvement in the city.
Yeah.
They had already started facing their problems from the East India Company, and they realized that they needed a place for themselves. So this was always a part of the British Crown. If there was any involvement of the East India Company, it must have been purely commercial, like land owning and so on, but no administrative use of the East India Company. Outside, in terms of government of India per se, up to 1858, when the Crown took over, there was a certain connection between how the Pete was governed and how they interacted with the rest of the government of India per se, with either Fort St. George in Madras or with Calcutta. So this would have been the early part of how it worked. So as far as the cantonment itself was concerned, there's a notion that somehow the cantonment life was distinct from the city life, etc., etc. I don't know how much of this is assumed, because the principal residents of the cantonment, in terms of sheer numbers, were Indians. Even when places like Richardstown and the others came about, in their annals, they very specifically talk about how are we going to attract rich Indians to buy property over here.
Okay.
So when people have told me, oh, they built, they wanted to exclude this or exclude that and so on, I find it a little hard to find any evidence of any of that.
Great. This was a fascinating conversation, Ramji. I think many of the things that we see in the city today, right, is really dates back to the centuries, as you spoke about. And maybe a city trying to find itself, right, amidst big growth, big change. Maybe roots is where we go back to, history is where we go back to.
There's a point in question over there. I don't think the city ever tried to find itself. I think others have been trying to find the city.
Maybe, yes.
Successfully.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe that's what it is, right? We all are trying to find the city, and city is different things to different people, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Fantastic conversation to have with you.
Likewise.
Thank you.